Hello everyone and welcome to video tutorial 15. You should now know all about specialized cells and you should be able to pause the video and answer the starter activity. You should be able to describe one of the cell structures and functions. So try to do that before I reveal the answers to you. So the answers are, if you pick the red blood cell, its function would be that it transports oxygen, and its specialized structure would be that it has a large surface area, no nucleus, and hemoglobin to maximise the volume of oxygen it can carry around the body. If you picked a sperm cell, it would be that its function is fertilisation, and its specialised structure is that it has a tail so it can swim to the egg, and it is also haploid so that it is allowed to fuse at fertilisation to produce a diploid cycle. So if you managed to answer that correctly, well done. If you struggle to get the answers, then you need to go back and watch the previous videos. Today we're going to be moving on to the nervous system, which is part of key area 2. If you want the worksheets that go with the video, remember to pause the video and go to 2 multicellular, 2 control and communication, 2 consumables and activities, 2.1 nervous system. The PowerPoint is found in PowerPoint and is called 2.1a nervous system reactions. So today we are going to be learning about the nervous system. Our learning intention is to learn to name the 3 parts of the nervous system, describe how nerve impulses are transmitted, name 3 parts of the brain and what they are used for, and describe how a synapse is used to communicate between neurons. To be successful, you'll be able to label the diagrams of the CNS and the brain. Describe the function of each part of the brain, which includes the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the medulla. Identify that the information is passed along a neuron by electrical impulses, and write an explanation of the synapse. And know and sort the orders of a nerve impulse into the correct stages. How do we make our bodies move in response to a stimuli? How do we control our reactions? For example, how do our cells communicate to move away from danger? Internal control and communication is required for survival of a multicellular organism. This is because cells in the whole organism cannot function independently of each other. They need to communicate. In animals, there are 2 types of communication, which are nervous control communication and hormonal control communication. So now pause the video and click on the link to watch about the nervous system and how it works, or you can go back to the link at the end. The central nervous system is also known as CNS for short. It is made up of 2 parts, which are the brain and the spinal cord. You need to know that the 2 parts of the CNS are the brain and the spinal cord. Usually you would stick the person in your jar and you would colour in the CNS blue, so you'd colour in the brain blue and the spinal cord blue. The nerves are then referred to as the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS for short, and you would usually colour these in green. You can find this diagram in your activities and consumables. You should now have the knowledge to be able to fill in the blanks on the diagram. You can find the diagram in the consumables and activities. Pause the video and try to fill in the blanks before I go over the answers. So the answers are that the central nervous system, CNS, is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is all of the nerves in the body. So well done if you managed to get that correct. So now let's look at the brain in more detail. The human brain is made up of billions of neurons. It is divided into 3 different regions, which are called the cerebrum. The cerebrum controls conscious responses and higher skills such as memory, language, and intelligence. Then we've got the cerebellum, which sounds like a ballerina. It controls balance and coordination of movement. And the last part of the brain that we need to know is the medulla, which controls breathing rate and heart rate, so all of your unconscious processes. So we now need to be able to label the different parts of the brain. So the cerebellum is the first part that we're going to look at, and that is the part which is at the back of the head and supports the bigger part, and it's like a ballet dancer, so it's for coordination and balance. Then we've got the biggest part of the brain, which is this part here, which is the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is where all of our conscious thought is, so that's why it's so big. And then the last part that we need to be able to label is the medulla, which is basically the stem of the brain which holds everything up. So you now need to be able to print that off and label it, and you can find this diagram in activities and consumables. Here is another diagram of the brain. So again, we've got our cerebellum, which is for coordination and balance. We have our cerebrum, which is the big part that controls all our conscious thoughts and emotions. And then we've got our medulla, which is for our automatic functions, so like our heart rate and breathing. You should now be able to pause the video and sort the table into the correct order so that the information is correct. So try to do that and pause the video before I go over the answers. So the answers are that the cerebrum is for thinking and processing information, so for conscious thought. The cerebellum is for coordination of movement, so posture and balance. And lastly, the medulla is for the control of automatic functions, so the things that you don't think about, so like breathing and heart rate. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If you didn't, then you need to go back and watch the video from the start. Now let's look at nerves in more detail. So nerves are also called the neurons, and there are 3 different types of neurons that you need to know. So you need to know about your sensory nerve or neuron, your inner nerve or neuron, and your motor nerve or neuron. And you can see a picture of a typical cell. So you've got your cell body, and then you've got your axon fiber. And you should know that your nerve impulse always travels from your sensory fiber to your axon fiber. Sensory fiber means going towards, axon fiber means going away. So looking at your 3 types of neurons in more detail. So your interneuron, there's a picture of it. It operates in the CNS, so obviously your brain and your spinal cord, and it processes information from the sensory neuron and then it sends it to the motor neuron. Your sensory nerve is the thing that comes first. So your sensory nerve passes information from the stimulus, so it might be a light source, to the interneuron where the information can be sorted. And lastly, your motor neuron is the thing that always comes last. So your motor neuron, meaning like go, always comes last. So it passes information from the interneurons to the effectors, which enables a response. So this could be a muscle contraction or a gland releasing hormones. So now you should be able to sort the different neurons with their correct function and diagram. So pause the video and try to sort the table into the correct order before I go over the answers. So the answers would be that the interneuron operates within the CNS, which processes information from the sensory to the motor neuron, so it's basically in the middle of the 2. The sensory neuron or nerve comes first. It passes information from the stimulus to the interneuron, and the motor neuron or nerve is always last, and it passes information from the interneuron to the effector, which enables a response to occur, so e.g. a muscle contraction or a gland releasing hormone. So how is the information transferred? So the information is passed along nerves to the central nervous system, remember, which is your spine and your brain, and then back in the form of electrical messages called impulses. So you need to know that for nerves and the nervous system, your messages are passed on in electrical messages called impulses. So you need to make a note of this. So at the end of each nerve or neuron, so your sensory nerve, your inner nerve, and your motor nerve, there is always a synapse. So your synapse is a gap between the 2 neurons, and your neurons don't touch each other. So when a stimuli stimulates a receptor, the electrical impulse travels down the neuron, and then at the end of the neuron, the electrical impulse stimulates the release of chemicals, which are called neurotransmitters. These chemicals then bind to receptors on the next neuron and then stimulate an electrical impulse to travel on. So now pause the video and go to the link to watch the video on the synapse, or you can go back to it at the end. You need to know about synapses and be able to answer the question on them, so you need to make a note on synapses, and you can get the diagram from activities and consumables. So you'd want to write that electrical impulses travel from one neuron to another neuron. Neurons do not directly touch each other. There is a small gap between them called a synapse. So electrical impulses from one neuron stimulate the release of chemicals, neurotransmitters. The chemicals bind to the receptors on the next neuron and stimulate electrical impulses to travel on. The advantage of them using chemicals here is that your nerve is not stimulated the whole time. So make sure you've got that noted, and make sure that you know that the synapse is the gap between two neurons, and your electrical impulse causes the release of chemicals from your neuron, and then that triggers the receptors on the next neuron to cause the electrical impulse down that. So what is this stimulus thing that we keep referring to, and how do you detect it? So a stimulus is any change in the environment. So for example, touching a candle, your stimulus would be the candle because it would be hot. So what would happen? You'd probably end up moving your hand away from the candle because it would be hot. The next picture, which shows the eye, if you have the lights dark and you switch on the lights, you should see your pupil enlarge, and if you look in the mirror, and that's so that your pupil protects your eye from the light. If you look at the next picture of the woman tasting the lemon, it's usually bitter, so you usually screw up your face. And if you look at the picture where the person's cutting something and then they might cut their finger, again the response would be to move away from this, so the stimulus would be the knife. And then lastly, the person holding their ears, you might get a stimulus of a loud noise and it might cause you to grip your ears. So the nervous system is the reason that we can react to any sort of stimuli, and it's the reason that we can respond to things in our environment, and it's what protects us. So parts of our body we use to sense things are called our sense organs, and we should know from primary school that our sense organs are our eyes, our ears, our mouth, our skin, and our nose. So each of our sense organs have special cells called receptor cells, and each receptor cell is sensitive to different things. So our receptors in our eyes are sensitive to light, our receptors in our ears are sensitive to sound, our receptors on our tongue are sensitive to chemicals, our receptors in our nose are sensitive to chemicals, and our receptors in our skin are sensitive to touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. You should use this paragraph to help you complete the diagram that's coming up next, and you would also make a note of this. So the paragraph is that your sense organ receptors detect information, so the stimuli, and this passes the information onto the sensory nerve. Then a nerve impulse is carried along a sensory nerve to the central nervous system, and the information is processed by the interneurons in the CNS. And then a nerve impulse is sent along a motor neuron from the CNS, and then this stimulates the response. So now you should be able to try to complete the diagram with these words from what we've just spoken about. So pause the video and try to complete this. So we should have our stimulus, and then we should know that it is going to be our receptors that are in our sense organs that pick up stimulus. Then it runs through our sensory nerve, which then runs to our CNS, and it's our interneurons that sort out the information, which then goes to our motor nerves, which then goes to our effector, which could be a muscle contraction or it could be a hormone released from a gland, and then this triggers a response. So maybe it will be like moving your hand away or so forth. So make sure you've completed the diagram, and it's found in activities and consumables. An example of a stimuli is a ball coming towards you. So what sensory organ would detect a ball coming towards you? So this would be detected by the receptors in our eyes. So it would trigger the receptors in our eyes. Then the information about the ball coming towards us would then be passed from the receptors to the sensory nerve, which would carry this impulse electrical message to the CNS. Then the message is received at the CNS, which is obviously your brain and your spinal cord, and then the brain and the spinal cord would sort out this information and decide what it wanted to do with it, and then it would send its electrical message impulse to the motor nerve. The message then travels from the CNS along the motor nerve to the body's effector, so e.g. a muscle, and then the muscle will then cause a response. So your effector responds, so e.g. your muscle moves and the ball is. So to summarise, in this scenario, the stimulus would be a ball coming towards you. Then it would be detected by receptors in a sense organ, such as your eye seeing the ball. And then this would be then passed, and the impulse would be passed to your sensory nerve. Your sensory nerve would then pass this electrical impulse to the CNS, so it would be sorted out by the brain and the spinal cord. Then an a decision would be made, which would then be passed by an electrical impulse to the motor nerve. Your motor nerve would then stimulate an effector, which would cause a response. So your effector would either be a muscle or a gland. In this case, it would be a muscle, and it would tell you to catch the ball in this case. Again, this is just a summary of what we've just said. So you would have your stimulus, and then that would be your ball coming towards you. Your receptors would be triggered. Then it would travel to your sensory nerve. Your sensory nerve is always first, which would then travel to the CNS, where the information would be sorted out to know what you were going to do. Then the electrical impulse would be passed to your motor neuron or nerve, which would then trigger an effector, which would be, for example, your muscle or an endocrine gland, which would then trigger a response. So, for example, your muscle catching the ball. So from what we've said previously, you should now be able to put all of these different steps of the flow of information into the correct order before I go over the answers. So try to pause the video and do that now. So the correct answers would be that an environmental change causes a stimulus. Then your sense organ receptors detect the stimulus. Then a nerve impulse is carried along a sensory nerve to the CNS. The information is processed by the interneurons in the CNS. A nerve impulse is sent along a motor nerve, and this stimulates the effector to produce a response, so for example, a muscle contraction. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If you didn't, you need to go watch the video again from the start. Let's try some SQA questions that have come up previously in the past. So question 1 says the list below refers to the stages in response of the nervous system to a stimulus. And you need to put the stages in order. So we've got 1, central nervous system sorts out information. 2, electrical impulses sent to the muscles. 3, electrical impulses sent to the central nervous system. 4, sense organ detects the stimulus. And 5, response produced. So let's have a think. So pause the video and then try to answer it before I go over the answer. So the answer to this would be A. So it would be your sense organ detects the stimulus, so number 4, followed by 3, which is your electrical impulses sent to the central nervous system. Then it would be 1, the central nervous system sorts out the information, and then it would be 2, your electrical impulses sent to your muscle, and then it would be 5, a response is produced. So well done if you managed to get that correct. So another SQA question that's come up is that the diagram below shows neurons connecting the eye with the central nervous system. And then it says, which line in the table below identifies correctly the types of neurons and the direction of impulses which travel along them. So we have our eye with our receptors, and then we've got our neuron 1, and then we've got our central nervous system, and then we've got our neuron 2. So we should know that the first nerve is always going to be, well, pause the video and you put what you think first of all, and then I'll go over the answers. So the answer would be B, and the reason being is the first neuron is always the sensory and the second neuron is always the motor. So the next question is the diagram below shows a section for the human brain, so which letter indicates the site of memory and reasoning? So pause the video and try to figure out what letter it is before I go over the answer. So we should have got that it was A, because that is the cerebrum, which controls all conscious thought. Then the next question is that different parts of the brain have different functions, so match the parts of the brain to its function. So we've got our 1 cerebrum, A controls heart rate, 2 cerebellum, B controls balance, and 3 medulla, C memory and reasoning. So see if you can match the correct part with its function. So pause the video and try to do that before I go over the answers. So the answers are that your cerebrum is for memory and reasoning, so all your conscious thought. Your cerebellum controls balance and coordination, and your medulla controls heart rate and breathing rate and all your automatic things that you can't control. Now you can complete the activities below to review your learning by doing the multicellular exam practice questions on page 32 to page 34. We have now come to the end of the lesson, so you should be able to label the diagram of the CNS and label the diagram of the brain. You should be able to describe the function of each part of the brain, so the cerebrum with its conscious thoughts, the cerebellum with its balance and coordination, and the medulla with its automatic processes like breathing and heart rate. You should be able to identify the information as passed along neurons in electrical impulses. You should be able to write an explanation of the synapse, including that it's the gap between two neurons and the chemicals released. You should be able to know and sort all of the different nerve impulses into the correct order and stages. So that would be your stimulus going to your sensory nerve, going to your CNS, going to your motor nerve, going to your effector, and going to your response. So well done if you can confidently do that all. If you can't, then you need to watch the video again. So that is the end of this video tutorial. Woohoo! Thank you for listening.